Hi, welcome to the first Let's Talk About Roman Life Classics podcast. I'm your host today, Jake, and today we're going to be talking about the chapter Theaters and Plays, which is one of the shorter chapters in Roman life, and it's one of my favorite. So the way I usually do studying is I will split things into categories just to make it easier to remember and just compare it all to. So that's how I'm going to be teaching this. So for theaters and plays, there is about eight important people. Some of them more important than others, but we still have to learn about all of them. There's a couple of terms that have to deal with the Roman stage, and there's also just a bunch of other things that they've thrown in there that are still pretty good to hold on to and know. So I'm going to start with the people. Coming in, number one, we have Juvenal. And Juvenal is only mentioned once in the book, or in this chapter rather, and he is said to have declared that the people want free bread and shows in the circus. And you've got Marcus Aurelius, who is said to have lived from 161 to 180 AD. And in his time, like holidays and theaters became so important to the people that there were 135 days out of the year while he was around and were dedicated to holidays. And then there is Plautus and Terence, who were Roman comedy writers. And they're the only comedies that we have today as proof of like the existence of Roman comedies. Theirs are the only one that remain. Their comedies were based off of Greek life and resembled our modern days comic operas or rom-coms. Not rom-coms, just comedies. It's also said that the only makeup required in plays during their time was makeup used for women's parts being played by men. And it's also said that they wrote the best comedies during 200 to 160 BC, while there were no accommodations being made for the actors or the audience. And now there's just Plautus by himself. In Plautus's time, plays took place in the morning, but previous to that, since they had no like lighting to use to hold things at night, they were usually done after the meal noon. And then there's Pompey. Pompey ended up erecting the first permanent theater at Rome on the Campus Martius in 55 BC. It's said to have sat around 10,000, and it's also based on a theater that he had seen on the island of Lesbos in Mytilene. It is erected on flat ground instead of the typical slope that or hill that the Greeks like to use to build their temporary theaters on. And it was the only temporary theater for about 42 years until 13 BC, when there were another two theaters that were built that I will mention later. Now, Pliny the Elder comes in this chapter and he says that, well, other people said that Pompey's theater sat around 10,000. He, out of nowhere, comes in and says, yeah, 40,000, take it or leave it. So we have to trust Pliny the Elder here. And then we have Martial, who, in a letter that he's written, tells us of, like, ushers or bouncers for the Roman theater who would get really into kicking people out of their spot if it wasn't like, or not their spot, but if they were trying to sit down somewhere that was reserved for the knights, they would definitely kick them out of there. And then there's Augustus, who built the second and third permanent or second or third permanent theater in Rome to honor his nephew Marcellus. This theater is said to have seated around 10 to 14,000 spectators. And then finally we have Cicero, who describes some of the shows that Pompey put on to celebrate the opening of his theater that I will mention later. There's a very, very fun and important list you have to memorize for that. Alright. Now on to the terms. So there's like this umbrella term for shows in Latin, and the term shows translates to ludi. So you have three different kinds of shows, very important to know these. You have ludi skyneki, which would be drama or plays, munera gladiatoria, which were gladiator fights, and then ludi circenses. which is a chariot race or other shows associated with the circus, hence the name circenses, which has to do with circumference. And then the other terms we have to know are related to positioning on the stage. So you have orchestra, which is the dancing place, and it was derived into what we know as an orchestra, which is a large band or a large area for the band to play. But since Romans didn't use the orchestra, there was rarely like musical accompaniment to what they were trying to do. It kind of took the purpose of dancing place just because there wasn't really any other value to it. You also have, for stage parts, proscaenum, which is the back of the stage, scaena, which is the stage or where the actors perform, cavei, which is seats for spectators, cunei, which is like wedges or like the little slices of pie that they would divide the seats into. Like in this picture over here, all of these little slits or all these little bits that have been divided, those are all called cunei. And then there's also vela or awnings, which were used or like added into theaters later on and were used to help protect the crowd from the sun. And now we just have a full page of just not useless, but like kind of important stuff that gets asked about, but it just has nothing to do with any of the other stuff. There's no real grouping for it. Okay. So entertaining the Roman people was difficult, and it was difficult because they were thrill seeking and they were very picky about their entertainment. So it was very expensive to host like a gladiator fight, which is what generally okay, still recording. Which is what generally would please them as a population. And public games became so popular, like they came out of nowhere and took the mass like enjoyment of the crowd to the point where they became exploited by politicians to try and get votes in upcoming political escapades, to the point where they would just say, okay, here, come on, vote for me in the next election, and I will let you into my play for free to watch people kill each other. So, as I mentioned before, Marcus Aurelius had 135 days dedicated to holidays, but by the end of the Republic, or before his time, there were 66 days dedicated to the holidays, which is also important to know. Generally, when an important man died, they would hold funeral games, just as a celebration for him. There are 4 main types of plays. There are comedies, tragedies, pantomimes, and farces, but pantomimes and farces, or the last two, are the most popular. All the plays and acts that were put on were always supervised or monitored by a state official. Let's see. Women were played by men until pretty much up until Shakespeare's time. Characters in comedies wore like very drabby, inexpensive costumes. And actors, if they wanted to represent another person, what they would do is they would put on a different wig depending on like where their status was. If you had a gray wig, you were representing an old man. If you had a black wig, you were representing a young man. If you had a red wig, you would represent a slave. And also, if you had a very successful dinner that went well or better than usual, the manager customarily bought dinner for, or treated the cast and crew out to dinner. And generally, before Pompey's first permanent theater in 55 BC, it was mostly temporary stages that were built at the base of a hill or a grassy, the base of a slope or a grassy hill. Let's see. For comedies, the backdrop was always on the street, which allowed the actors to get off and get onto the stage through the doors. So they were actually purposed instead of just being a backdrop. And they always kept an altar on the stage, which I'm pretty sure you can see right here. And the purpose of the altar was to remind the crowd that there was religious purposes behind the acts, or that there had originally been religious purposes. There's an important list that you should probably know, because they ask about this a lot. It was hard to hear the actors' voices because of crowds that were pushing, men and women disputing, and children wailing. Improvements to theaters and plays were made at about 145 BC. And from 67 BC, the first 14 rows behind the ones that were reserved for the senators were reserved for the knights. And then here's that important list from before, from Cicero's letter, where Pompey, in one of his amazing plays to signify the opening of his theater, used troops of cavalry, bodies from the infantry, hundreds of mules loaded with spoils of war, and 3,000 bowls of mixing wine to make his plays and acts more impressive. Senators had some sort of like secret passage to get to their special seats in front of everyone, and you would access that like row of seats at either the left or right side of the stage. And generally the best seats were reserved for emperors or officials on one side, like on the far right or left, and on the other side was reserved for the Vestal Virgins. The Roman stage was about 120 to 180 feet long, and an example of a portico was found at the Theater of Ostia in Minuteria, or Minturnae. There we go. All right. Thank you for tuning in to Let's Talk About Roman Life, Episode 1. Thanks for listening, and feedback would be appreciated if you wanted, like, interesting stuff instead of just a drone about all the information. So, yeah, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.